This is a Rough Tiger production.
And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful. That is
on
not a
the
song.
brain. Oh, I'm sorry, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Hi, folks.
Hello, everybody. Happy October. As we forge on through the month of October. My name is Morris. That's Bryan. This is Dream Idiots.
Welcome
And
back.
We were just discussing when we start singing songs incorrectly in public places. Each week, Bryan and I tell stories to one another and bring you along for the ride. Bryan may not be around much longer in this episode because I think he's actually dying there on the other side of Zoom. We shall see.
Going in for my lung replacement here soon. Just allergies or something or going. I don't know what it is, but I'm enjoying some lovely flan right here.
Oh God. Oh.
Yes, but thanks for listening and tuning in. Thanks especially to someone in Pearland, Texas, downloaded like 35 episodes of ours all at once, all one day. Normally little spikes like that I can't really see unless I can see them on a map. So there's someone in Pearland found us and likes us. So thank you for that. If you want to get more Dream Idiots in your life, you can check out dreamidiots.com. And we're on Instagram and Facebook at Dream Idiots. Drop us a line at dreamidiotspodcast@gmail. Send us a curse word you want us to try. Drop us a line just to say, hey, give us a story idea, whatever you'd like. And if you can, on whatever platform you're listening, if you can give us a review, shoot us 5 stars, that would be great. Helps us climb the charts. We'd appreciate it.
Hopefully that downloading wasn't preceded by what's a cure for insomnia. Download Dream Idiots. Bryan, we discussed beforehand, neither of us have a update, although my house is a house divided right now. My wife is rooting for the Astros and I'm rooting for
You're rooting for not the Astros?
Not the Astros, my beloved American League team, the Minnesota Twins, of whom I am a very strange, since I was a little kid, fan of the Minnesota Twins growing up in San Antonio, Texas. And so we are a house divided right now watching that baseball series. That's the only update I got. So,
all right, nothing for me, but we have some interesting stuff coming up here over the next few weeks as we should hit episode 100 by the end of the year, I think, almost exactly. So,
woohoo!
Lots more to come. So episode 85, we're going back to the story I started last week about good old Jean-Charles Houzeau. So
he was the Belgian fellow, right? Who was doing some traveling around.
Mm-hmm. He was a big
Texas
fan
and Louisiana.
He was a big fan of looking up into the night sky occasionally and trying to figure out what all those little blinking lights were doing. But we'll come to that a little bit later on. If you want to get the full context of this story, you may want to go back and listen to part 1 from last week, October 3rd. That might help. Quick summary, though, I can give you here. Jean-Charles Houzeau was born in what is now Belgium to a wealthy aristocratic family. He's super smart. By the time he's a teenager, he is conversant in at least French, Dutch, and German. Later in life, picks up English and Spanish as well. He's a bit of a hardcore lefty revolutionary, even though he's wealthy. He associates with lots of poor folks and commoners, starts to embark on a career in academics, but his politics sort of become the front burner issue for him. He marries a woman who is actually of a much lower social class, and that's one of the things that caused him to be a little bit ostracized from his family. Nevertheless, he takes off in 1857 and goes to America, lands in New Orleans in 1857. By the spring of 1858, he's in Texas. On the way over, even though he's wealthy, on the boat he travels in, which I'm not sure how long that would have taken in the 1850s, but he's traveling with peasants down in the bottom of this boat, is basically fed pea soup and table scraps all the way. In Texas, he's doing some writing, does some surveying in Galveston, San Antonio, and down in the Uvalde area. It's clear from his politics that he is fervently anti-slavery. He's an abolitionist. He helps some former slaves escape to the north. He also helps some Mexicans, some Tejanos, escape across the river to the south. And he also helps a man named Charles Anderson, who we talked about last week. He was a prominent white abolitionist, escape. Anderson is being held because he's also against slavery. And Texas, obviously, as we all recall, was part of the Confederacy. So just mentioning here again, Houzeau, the important thing about Houzeau is that he could be described as a dark-skinned white man or a light-skinned black man. He seems to shift pretty easily from community to community, assuming sort of whichever race he encounters. The Texas Army actually wants to conscript him at one point, promising they'll make him an officer, but he obviously doesn't want to fight in the Civil War. He refuses. He's under threat of arrest. He changes his clothes. A note here I didn't actually include in last week's episode regarding his disguise. When he's escaping Texas, he travels in what is described as, in two different sources, as a blue sombrero, a yellow shirt, and some red and white striped pants, which doesn't really sound like you're like, okay, are you also making balloon animals and blaring a trump, like screaming Via con Dios? Like you're not really blending in. Anyway, he claims his name is Carlos Houzeau. He's driving some oxen. He makes it all the way to the border, even though he has a bunch of unionist documents rolled up in the barrel of his shotgun. He makes it across the border. So, picking up our story, he spends a year in Matamoros doing some work there. He still has contacts back in Paris, France, and he writes there and somehow gains permission from French authorities to travel to New Orleans. I'm not crystal clear on how this would have impacted things. Obviously, this part of Louisiana was French territory, but by now it's part of America. In any case, gaining this sort of special permission, gains him access. He boards the USS warship, the Kensington, down in Mexico, sails to New Orleans because he promises that he will never step on Texas soil ever again. So he heads to New Orleans. San Antonio in 1860 had a population of 8,000 people. It was the biggest city in the state. Galveston was actually the second biggest city. 8,000 people, had a total of 350 slaves. And in San Antonio at the time, German speakers actually outnumbered both Anglos and Tejanos at the time. Any idea what the population of New Orleans was at the same time? If you wanted to take a stab.
I'm going to guess probably considerably more than that.
Population of New Orleans is 168,000 people.
Holy cow.
Yeah. 2/3 of whom are Black, Haitian, Creole, mulatto, which is a term that makes my skin crawl nearly as much as the N-word does. But mulatto was the common word used for folks that were of mixed race. And
it was a government term, right? I mean, it was an official government term, wasn't it?
I think it may have been, but then over time it sort of became a word that was absolutely just a slur, just an insult.
Right.
All right. So when Houzeau comes to New Orleans, he starts working for a publication called Le Union. It's a French newspaper. He starts contributing to it in English. Shortly thereafter, it changes its name. It becomes the New Orleans Tribune.
Right. And he was writing a column on the Saints preseason choices, right? Is that
doing bagel reviews of bakeries. Yeah.
Okay.
So when he changes the name to the Tribune, and it is the first daily newspaper written for Black people anywhere in America.
Wow.
And has a wide readership, wide circulation. For a period of time, he actually travels. I presume he had to have gone by boat and gone the long way around. Travels to Philly and lives in Philly for a period of time, and is writing and working there. shortly thereafter, toward the end of the Civil War, comes back to New Orleans and actually becomes editor of the Tribune. So in his writings, he is sharing all these ideas for how greater degrees of Black freedom can be attained, how you can try to gain Black unity across class differences, across regional divides. You have all these freedmen who are sort of undercutting the wage, the prices of the white folks. You have former slaves who were being paid nothing, who will now happily accept $1 a day, but they're aggravating the white men who were making $5 a day and are now not making the $3 a day because they're being undercut. So there's all kinds of strife because of these different allegiances. So Houzeau obviously is fluent in French. As I said, he has a light brown complexion. The owners of the paper, all of whom were light-skinned Black men, and who also spoke French. At least one of the owners of the paper had actually studied in Paris at a time, had first assumed Houzeau was a light-skinned Creole man as well, until he told them otherwise. He acknowledged that, no, I'm just a Western European. They asked him to become editor of the paper. However, they didn't disclose his race. In fact, the Tribune kind of happily emphasized that the paper was, quote, edited by men of color, and that it would never be controlled by any white man. Houzeau kind of just decides not to dispute this, as he has on several occasions now in the past, and begins to sort of actively pass himself off as being Black. And does this only because everyone assumes that this is in everyone's best interest, especially the paper's best interest, for him to not be white. But because he's a gifted writer, he's so smart, he's multilingual, they need him in this role.
So it was what you would call, I guess, an open secret. Like,
yeah,
everyone knows, no one talks about it.
Yeah, at least a little bit of an open secret, but it's clear. Houzeau talks about later on that throughout his life, whenever anyone asks him about it, he kind of just he kind of refuses to address it straight on. And so it's just a source of misinformation through his entire life.
How about those Saints, huh? Yeah.
So
I'm still stuck on the fact that it's the first paper for people of color in the United States.
First daily paper, yeah.
First daily paper, because the history of that so often in mainstream history gets shifted to the 20th century in places like Pittsburgh, Detroit, right? All the cities of the Great Migration, as opposed to
right.
someplace that is very clearly South, which is fascinating to me. That's a hell of a little, historical nugget right there.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's in this role for a pretty good period of time. July 30th, 1866 rolls around. Civil War is over, but there is a peaceful demonstration of mostly freedmen that takes place outside of a building called the Mechanics Institute. And they are now reconvening the Louisiana Constitutional Convention. They're hammering out all of these issues tied to Reconstruction, and they're in the very, very infancy stages of trying to nail down all the post-Civil War insanity, so that life can begin to, I wouldn't say return to normal. I mean, it's a brand new existence pretty much for everyone. So this demonstration is held by these Black freedmen, and they're basically set upon by a whole bunch of white rioters, virtually all of whom had been, white soldiers in the Confederacy, who are all now pissed off that they lost, and they are losing out opportunities. And, they always say Civil War, pitted brother against brother, etc. And you have to assume that there were some slave owners who were, quote unquote, I'm not defending slavery, but who were good slave owners. And there were some slave owners who were sadistic scumbags who were very enthusiastic about their racism. And there had to have been a bit of this spectrum. Some of these folks who, as we see now in the stridency of some folks that are on the far right in our country, even today, there are some people who who are incapable of acknowledging the fact that they might be complicit or might be guilty of some infractions along these lines. And there are people who will happily engage in violence. So there is this this riot that takes place during this convention. Houzeau is actually attending the convention, as you know, because he's covering it for the paper, and he witnesses some of this violence. During the course of this, you know, this sort of overnight, he and several others managed to sneak out of the building, make it across an alley, find the, you know, adjacent building, find a door that's unlocked, and sneak into a furniture maker's shop and hide out there for several hours. Next day, they finally, you know, they leave. The sun comes up. The official report from law enforcement says that the death toll is 38 people killed with 146 wounded, of whom 34 dead and 119 wounded were black freedmen. The unofficial estimates were way higher. There's one total that suggests 40 or 50 black, mostly men, were killed. But it's likely that as many as 200 black people were killed as a part of these protests. And then a handful of attendees for the convention that were white were killed. One white protester was killed. You know, New Orleans had been occupied during the Civil War for much of this time, and this is just a carryover. This is really just another battle of the Civil War. The massacre, you know, expressed these deeply rooted conflicts going back really hundreds of years. But at this time, you have more than half of the whites who are in New Orleans at the time are Confederate veterans, but also nearly half of the black Americans in New Orleans were veterans of the Union Army, because the war had ended, and a lot of these black folks in this area stayed in the area at the end of the war. And so conflict is unavoidable, pretty much. Right after the riots, Houzeau is working his tail off, working 20 hours a day for like 10 days straight, during which time he writes 30 column inches of stories, just kind of detailing the events of that night. He personally interviews 200 witnesses who saw various things. And by virtue of his work, his writing, basically his compilation of all this winds up being testimony, a number of the white accomplices, including a staggering number of white people that are allegedly in law enforcement who happily involved themselves in violence, were prosecuted, you know, as a direct result of Houzeau's work. So 1867 rolls around, and Houzeau is getting a little bit discontent again. It's very clear in his mind. He's now presenting himself as black. For his entire life, he has been leftist, anti-racism, anti-slavery, but now he's in the community where this unrest over slavery is beginning to shift a little bit, and you have a lot of folks that are that may appear to be black, or certainly suffered under slavery, who are French Creole of descent, who now don't really seem to have quite the same problem with racism that they used to. I mean, back when we were being oppressed and beaten by white people, we were anti-racism. But you know, he's now dealing with a bunch of Creoles who are now trying to be sort of white adjacent instead of black adjacent, right? So there's a lot of class strife here, and a lot of folks who had been victimized, who are now sort of happily saying, well, we may have been black previously, but we're better than those black people. And it's this sort of behavior that kind of leads him to have he's kind of just disgusted with it, and he decides he's done with New Orleans. So leaves there, and of all places winds up in Jamaica. Winds up spending several years there, 8 years, working on a plantation. Spends his time kind of a free and easy life. But by this time he's approximately 50. Does a fair amount of writing during this entire time. The reason we have the context about his story is he's a prolific writer. He writes for the paper, but he also is sending letters home quite a bit. In Jamaica, he's dabbling in science a little bit. He teaches a whole bunch of many neighboring kids the basics of reading and writing, teaches them some basic science as well. So he's sort of in this early retirement. Then the director of the Brussels Observatory back home dies, and Houzeau, in absentia, is appointed to replace him. So after nearly 20 years gone, he returns home. So he sails back to Belgium. So he works there for a certain period of time, and in the early 1880s, they are prepping for the 1882 transit of Venus. So you may recall that we discussed this way back in the early days of Dream Idiots. Episode 12, I told the story of the French astronomer Guillaume Le Gentil. So Le Gentil tried to view the transit of Venus in 1761. He missed it because he was at sea. And he tried again in 1769, but he had a cloudy day and he missed it completely. He was so angry that day, he didn't speak to anyone for 2 weeks afterwards. And then one of his assistants heard him yelling and screaming as he basically completely destroyed his lab. And then after more than a decade away from home, he sailed home to Paris with a terrible case of dysentery. So he had a bad trip and didn't get, gained nothing from all of his effort. Houzeau actually winds up faring much better. So he actually returns to San Antonio, Texas, in spite of promising never ever to do so, and sets up a small lab, a little observatory in a house in the Government Hill neighborhood, just off the south edge of Fort Sam Houston on Grayson Street. So basically, the transit of Venus is when, as with a solar eclipse, which we're about to have here, and in
next week
in my part of Texas, we have great viewing for it, a little just up in the hill country. As with a solar eclipse, basically a celestial body is passing between the Earth and the sun. Having now read quite a bit about the transit of Venus, I still don't really understand why it's viable, but I just understand that it is viable. Having that celestial body be backlit, I judge, allows certain precise calculations and measurements to be made. So Houzeau has some clouds that day, but he is able to capture 120 images that are able to nail down the distance from the Earth to the sun to within 1% of accuracy. And there was also, strangely, there was another team working very close by, actually on Fort Sam. There was an observatory already in existence at the base. They were working as well, literally just a few hundred yards away. The other Belgium team was working in Chile, and they had even more success. They captured, I think, like 500 images of the transit of Venus. And he actually, after doing all this work, he returns home a short time later. He actually passes away in 1888 at the ripe old age of 68. A couple little footnotes here. There was another transit of Venus in 2012. If you Google that, I may actually include an image of that in the notes for this episode. Venus, it's not as spectacular as a solar eclipse. Venus sort of appears to be a dime sitting on a manhole cover is how I would describe it. That's sort of the scale you're talking about. But with a level of technology that's been gained since his time, the images are definitely much cooler than what good old Houzeau could capture. And then regarding his race, regarding how he presented himself, he said toward the end of his life, quote, "For myself, I knew how to make myself a proletarian in Europe. It had not been difficult to make myself black in the United States. I think and I feel that which a freedman must think and feel. I do not consider things from the point of view of a protector, but as they have been told to me 100 times, I am really one of them." So as I mentioned the Rachel Dolezal story a little bit last week. I mean, you could, say something, say that his actions were maybe a little bit inappropriate, but I don't know. You have to. I think the good far outseeds the bad. And then I just wanted to include in here, because this was just on my mind as I was doing the research for this episode. I'm sure you did Texas history in public schools here, just as I did.
Seventh grade. Yeah,
Seventh grade.
Yeah.
And I have a very clear memory of being at Kruger Middle School, and I had a white, one of the few male teachers in middle school, and him talking about the fact that one day in the distant future, thousands of years from now, there will be a day that comes when Latino or Tejanos, or what we now say is Latinx, are the majority. And that's, it was very clearly that day was a day to be dreaded. And I recall thinking that day that, in this classroom, there's a Garcia and a Hernandez and a Ayala and a Rincon and a Gonzalez. And wow, how embarrassing for you that you would be so blatantly racist in front of all, like, what are you doing? By the way, that day that, Latinx became the majority happened during the 2020 census. That Texas is now majority minority, as they say. And then the other thought I had was, only people in Texas will recognize this or understand this. There is a bumper sticker or a slogan that says, "We didn't cross your border crossed us." Consider, that you're a dark-skinned person living anywhere in South Texas over the last 350 years, and you're in Spain, then you're in France, then you're back in Spain, now you're in Mexico, then you're in Texas, then you're in Mexico again. These borders kept changing, and these people, the vast majority of people prior to the 20th century spent their entire lives within 50 miles of the place of their birth, and their country keeps changing. And now in Texas, we have something like 14.5 million people who are Latinx of some version. Either they're Mexican, they're Panamanian, Colombian, whatever they are. But we're, in 2023, we have a administration now who has announced just in the past few days that they are going to start construction on 20 new miles of border wall along the Rio Grande in order to keep people out. And I think the same thing now that I've always thought, which is just let them in. Just, okay, who are you? What's your name? Oh, you're a teacher? Okay, you can go work there. Okay, you know how to, you work on cars? You're a nurse, you're a doctor. Do you have family here? Can we help you with job training? Can we help you find a place to live? Help them find a job, and don't spend presumably tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars keeping them out. They're already here. What are you doing? Anyway, just a little.
Or at the very least, don't try to murder them.
Right. Yeah. Well, baby steps. Right? First, don't murder them. Second, anyway. Very interesting story about this man, Jean-Charles Houzeau, that I stumbled across because I saw a historical marker, and then I wanted to sort of place that story in a little bit of a broader political context, I guess, because I'm just disgusted how this state works.
Well, no, it really reminds me of that bumper sticker I see every now and then that says, if you're worried about people crossing imaginary borders on a big rock hurtling through space,
right.
Maybe you're an asshole.
Right.
What an astonishing life, though. What an amazing life
right.
to have led back then. And in regards to the whole passing component of his life, again, I get back to the question of being allowed to pass versus actively trying to pass. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of what is at the crux of your story when it comes to like the other writers and editors of the paper saying, no, just keep doing what you're doing. We're
blend in. You're fine.
And then the fascinating element of coming down to, but we're French when it comes to the next level of what happens after the war. Fascinating stuff, Bryan. And all because you were doing something you shouldn't have in an alleyway between two dilapidated houses on the Government Hill area of San Antonio, doing whatever you were doing in that alleyway. That's amazing. The story of Jean-Charles Houzeau. I wish I'd never heard about him in Texas history class in 7th grade.
Well, of course,
So
because that would further this notion that diversity and embracing something besides a straight white guy perspective is good or acceptable. So
it's like that scene from Jean from John Sayles' Lone Star, where the woman says, "It's the mix of the cultures that's a problem. If you're talking about food and music, that's great, but anything else, it's all
right.
excited about it." Uh, all right, thank you, Brian. Do we have a curse word of the week this week?
It's time for the Dream Idiot's curse word of the week.
We do indeed. Curse word of the week this week is textertunist. One word. Textertunist.
I'm guessing it's a mix of texture or text and opportunist.
It's a mixture of text and opportunist. A textertunist is a person who claims that they are bad at texting until they want something from you. We've all had that person who you send it, hey, nothing comes back for 10 days until, hey, Morris, can I borrow your post hole digger or whatever the hell it is, right. So a text.
Hey, Morris, I'm in the situation between two dilapidated houses over in Government Hill. I really need a ride out of here.
I could stand some bail money. If you're there, pick up. Textertunist.
You weren't there when I needed the bag of quick lime. Can you at least give me some bail money, please?
Right.
I like that. Textertunist. Who says that we're always mired in the past? That's very current and modern hip. It is my go now. Yes,
It's yes.
Bryan, I'm going to tell you today about someone that is really nothing like Jean-Charles Houzeau. I'll tell you about a fellow by the name of Joe Matt. You ever heard that name, Joe Matt?
Joe Matt, no.
Mm-hmm. Joe spelled the usual way, Joe. Matt spelled the usual way, Matt. Well, Bryan, this has kind of cropped up the last few weeks with my Spire Christian Comics two-parter, and then we talked about Mouse, and I believe you brought up graphic novels at one point, and this is not an ongoing theme. This is just something that popped up because it popped up. I won't go as far as to say that Joe Matt was the voice of a generation for young cartoonists in the late 80s and early 90s, but I will say he was a voice, his own voice, which he expressed in a series of comic strips called Peep Show, originally published by Kitchen Sink Press from 1987 to 1991. Joe chronicled his own shortcomings, his fears, his hangups, his neuroses. Amongst the tops he covered in Peep Show were titled Tales from the Broom Factory, about a horrible summer job he once had, Why I Hate Living in Montreal, which is self-explanatory, The Joys of Being Raised Catholic, which he shares with Robert Crumb, who was clearly one of his idols in his cartooning career. Something that you and I have talked about, TV shows that made me horny as a kid. And he discussed Gilligan's Island, I Dream of Jeannie, and Beverly Hillbillies with Cousin Ellie at length. And one strip which I found particularly handy at restaurants and at parties, How to Quietly Take a Shit. And then there's the strip that got me into trouble at a hotel in Austin, Texas. It was titled The Boob. This specific strip was Joe's recollections of a cat his housemate once owned. The Boob was a, quote, extremely damaged cat with asthma, greasy fur, a protruding tongue, no upper teeth, severed vocal cords, and a cataract in his left eye. At first, Joe hated the cat, but that he came to love the little rascal, calling him the Boobster, the Boob Man, and Booberoni. I'll let you discover the joys of this cat if and when you read Peep Show, but as a little sample, the housemates had to counterweight the Boob's litter box with a cinder block. Otherwise, the Boob would flip the entire mess over when he perched on the edge while doing his business. The Boob would then careen out of the bathroom every time he was finished, terrified of the smells and sounds emanating from his own body, which are described by Joe Matt as the smell of burning and the sound of bagpipes. I laughed so hard while reading this ridiculousness that the hotel bartender asked me to keep it down twice, and I was completely sober. I eventually had to leave the bar and finish my reading in my room. That's what Joe Matt's Peep Show did to me the first time I read it. Peep Show eventually appeared on the stands as an ongoing comic book by Drawn and Quarterly Press out of Montreal. The book lasted for 14 issues, published between February of 1992 and October of 2006. Joe was nominated in 1990 for a Harvey Award for Best New Talent and received 3 more Harvey nominations for humor, 1991 through 1993. He was also Harvey nominated for his coloring work on a Batman and Grendel limited series in 1989. The bulk of his income, I think, came as a colorist rather than as a cartoonist. I've reread Peep Show in the last few weeks. I'll get to why in a moment. Peep Show has been reprinted in 3 separate volumes over the years. The Poor Bastard covers issues 1 through 6, the focus on the relationships he built while living in Canada. Fair Weather is a 4-issue look at his childhood in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. And Spent is basically a 4-issue deep dive into his own pornography addiction and his quest to create the perfect VHS porn mixtape with all of his favorite scenes on one handy tape. I found in my reread that the roughly annual publication of Peep Show during its lifetime was actually the perfect schedule. Too much of Joe's self-analysis all at once is overwhelming, but when it's measured out in small doses over the years, I think it constitutes art. Peep Show can't be absorbed all at once. The reader requires lots of time to consider, to reflect, and ultimately come to terms with their own relationship to Joe's ongoing autobiography. I found this early on in my rereading, much earlier in the Peep Show narrative than I anticipated, when I was forced to reconsider Joe's relationship with Trish, his girlfriend from the 80s and into the 90s. This relationship was the reason Joe relocated from Philadelphia to Montreal in 1988. It was a difficult relationship, even in the comic strip days. Trish punched Joe at one point. Joe bit her in retaliation. Joe spit at her, so she kicked him in the groin and threatened him with scissors. Joe finally left and spent a few hours wandering the neighborhood. The couple eventually made up, and in true Joe Matt fashion, he chronicled all of it in his comic strip. Then he wrote about Trish's reaction to the strip. She accused Joe of exaggeration, the scissors in particular. All of this is dark and disturbing. It's a rough, raw read, and Joe admitted here that he's an unreliable narrator. He allowed the character of Trish to file this complaint, to present the real-world Trish's side of the story. But as an audience, we can't know if this is actually true. The first issue of the actual Peep Show comic picks up on this uncomfortable thread, pulls at it, tugs at it, and by the time the first issue is over, there's this messy pile left behind, and yet another argument, this time over whether or not Joe is actually working or just goofing off. Trish grabbed Joe's arm while he's inking his artwork, and though it's not shown, he punches her right in the eye. The character of Trish has a bruise for the next few pages in the story. Joe hit her. Full stop. In talking with his friend and fellow cartoonist later in the story, a character named Seth, Joe rattles off the typical platitudes. She's, quote, been violent with me more times than I can count. Quote, I had to teach her a lesson. Quite frankly, it's repulsive. And again, it's just the first issue. I asked myself, why did I keep reading this book 30 years ago? Am I more sensitive to this topic now that I'm married, with kids, and have more years behind me than in front of me? Was I a worse person back then? Is it a matter of, to use a word I don't really care for, cancel culture? Is it because this is more prevalent in our society today that we're willing to talk about these things? Or is it because it's about the reader's relationship with the text? What about this text and my relationship to it allowed me to continue reading it over the years? My reread took me through Poor Bastard, Fair Weather, and finally Spent. I watched Joe through the years as he wrestled with his porn addiction, the memories of his childhood, and his modern struggles as a starving artist. Joe never chronicled another violent moment with a woman, at least not in the physical sense. The argument that pornography itself is a violent act against women is another matter entirely and beyond the scope of this piece. In Spent, the third and final volume of Peep Show, there's a scene that sums up all of Joe Matt's fears and obsessions. I didn't even mention his collections of old comic strips, vintage Pez dispensers, and Viewmaster reels. Joe writes, "Possessions possess those who possess them." It's so true. What else am I supposed to do? Just sit in an empty room all day? I'm only human. I need distractions, mostly from the fact that someday I'm going to die. It just seems so horrible and unfair. I don't ever want to get older, let alone die. And then the cat he's been cuddling with shits on him. It's funny and true. And coming away from reading an issue of Peep Show, I always feel something. Anger, often, relief, revulsion, pain, but I feel something. Isn't that what art is supposed to do? I could be wrong. And after this rereading, I still don't know how to deal with the violent relationship inherent in the early issues of Peep Show. It leaves me, at the very least, unsettled. Unless a treasure trove of unpublished material comes to light, we'll never know if Joe Matt found any kind of peace with his own mortality or his own shortcomings. He died on September 17th, 2023, barely 60 years old, at his drawing board of a massive heart attack. I'll leave it in the words of his friend and fellow cartoonist I mentioned earlier, Seth. "Pest or not, he's a true friend." I guess I'll just have to pick my friends more carefully in the future. Joe liked that sentiment, apparently. He included it in the very first Peep Show collection, published by Kitchen Sink Press in 1993. Joe Matt, cartoonist, 1963 to 2023. Sources for this piece, all of them written and drawn by Joe Matt. Peep Show, the cartoon Diary of Joe Matt from 1993 by Kitchen Sink Press from Northampton, Massachusetts. The Poor Bastard, 2002. Fair Weather from 2002. The Poor Bastard, Spent from 2007. All of these from Drawn and Quarterly Press out of Montreal. And that is Joe Matt.
Wow. Yeah, super interesting. I'm not a comic book guy, as you well know, but an interesting story, well told though, and I certainly appreciate the the artistic instinct, artistic mind.
Well, it's a difficult thing to come to terms with, that there are. I mean, what do I do with this? Do I throw my Peep Show books away? I mean, I've been disturbed by this panel since I read it 30 years ago.
Right.
But the books still sit on my shelf. What does that make me complicit? What the hell do I do with this? I mean, and now that he's gone, it's thanks, Joe. Now I'll never make
right. Yeah.
Never make sense of this. But tributes have been pouring in from around the cartooning world. I have not read them because I didn't want them to affect this piece. But if you look up his name, Joe Matt, Peep Show, you can read more about him and his work. I would like to say that his work is worth your time, but it can be very dark and disturbing, but at the same time, You can find a reason to laugh, but you got to deal with this. What do we do?
Right.
What do we do with what we know now? And I mean, we have to do that with a lot of folks these days.
Right.
Mainly and mostly men whose work we like.
Right.
What do we do with that? Be they film directors or sports stars or writers or actors, what do we do with that? And as men and as male consumers of their artistic vision, what complicity do we have in that that transaction? So
yeah, it's hard to know, where, I don't know, respect or admiration for ability feels like an endorsement, or feels like you're in favor of behavior that is out of bounds. So yeah, it's peculiar. It's a delicate thing to thread. Can be.
Yeah, it's easy for me to blow off like Woody Allen movies because I never liked Woody Allen, with the exception of Zelig. So it's easy for me to go, of course he's a creep, but look at the stuff that Roger Waters is up to from Pink Floyd, right? With all of his pro-Russia stuff lately. It's just kind of like, damn, Roger. I mean,
right. Or, Eric Clapton and Van Morrison being anti-COVID vaccine, or.
Well, there's a lot more to not like about Eric Clapton.
That's true.
Yeah, the Van Morrison one is particularly difficult.
I'm way more of a Van Morrison fan than I ever was an Eric Clapton fan.
Yeah, when I went to see Van Morrison in concert, it was like, what am I going to get? Am I going to get Van the man, or am I going to get Van the asshole? What's going to happen out here? And fortunately, we never know. We got Van the man, and it was a fantastic show, except for, of course, the people who are just waiting to hear Moondance and don't know, anything from his catalog.
Don't know Astral Weeks, right?
Right, exactly. Anyway, that's all I got, as depressing as it is. Hell of a way to end an episode. Let's go back to talking about what Bryan was doing in that alleyway.
It's way more fun. Yeah, it's super interesting though. I mean, you have to. Cool story, and it's certainly interesting to ponder how all this stuff impacts us. And again, like you said that you hate the term cancel culture, you hate using it as a word. The word I have hated, I'm sure, for 30 years is resonate. What resonates with you? But there are some things that the second you from media, from art, from culture, the second you take them in. I mean, there are a few things I can think about that when I play them back. And when I saw that, I knew that it was going to be stuck in my head forever. A couple episodes of MASH, the last episode of MASH, a couple others during the series that were just either funny, but just poignant, interesting, but really, really dark. When I watched them, I remember just being, jaw agape, like, oh God, yep, I'm never going to forget that.
The one where BJ keeps the guy alive through Christmas, so his kids don't have to remember Christmas is the day their daddy died. Oh my God.
Right.
Spoiler alert for a 50-year-old TV show.
The episode, I believe the actor's name is Robert Herman. He later on was the dad or the grandfather on.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't. But
he was in Lost Boys. Yeah.
He recently passed away during COVID. He was in his 70s or early 80s. Mm-hmm. He's on one episode of MASH, and comes in, and just due to all the surgery and all the blood and all the carnage, basically loses his mind. And that I remember watching that, thinking, his portrayal of that story, which was actually directed by Mike Farrell, was gut wrenching. Was just and I.
That's the proper response to war, right there.
Right. It's like, and so and I watched MASH religiously, and I would occasionally, because I watched reruns. I mean, some of those episodes I could recite the whole episode from memory, but occasionally that episode would come back on. You know what? I don't need to watch that one again. I want to,
Yeah.
That one's. I got the. Yeah, I'm okay. I don't. I don't need that downer today. But there are some things like that. The opening sequence to Saving Private Ryan. That whole war. I've seen that come up on TV a couple times. Nope, I can't watch that again. Done perfectly. I remember just being awestruck by it. I'm not going to watch it again ever.
Yeah, the kid hiding in the outhouse scene in Schindler's List. I don't need to.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
So.
And then there's the scene that got me in trouble, and that is an absolutely true story. The boob, reading the boob, and the bartender saying, "Sir, please." There are people trying to have conversation, and I'm sitting in the corner, just tears streaming down my face as I'm reading about this overweight, unhealthy, asthmatic cat. And I'm still laughing about it. Just the horror show of this poor cat. Sir, you'll have to leave now. I know. I apologize. I'm so sorry. Can I take my drink? No, leave your drink here, sir. But it's so. I was supposed to meet someone in the bar too, and they're like, "Where were you?" And I said, "I had to leave. They asked me to go because of this book."
Well, that was certainly a varied episode, but thanks for listening, folks.
Yes.
We
As
certainly
always.
appreciate it. Please like, share, subscribe. Check us out online at dreamidiots.com, Facebook, Instagram. And please, occasionally, not many folks reach out by email, but drop us a line, dreamidiotspodcast@gmail.com. We will respond. And we appreciate you hanging in there with us.
Yes, indeedly. And be good to each other, as always.
This is a Rough Tiger production.
Bong bong,
Mm-hmm.
Bryan.
Bong bong?
Bong bong.
Bong bong. Good.